This week on the It's a Monkey podcast.
So now we're moving from what's happening now into the future. But it's an interesting concept, right? Where you think about Internet of Things, all of the elements connecting and becoming a foundation of a true revolution, right? So because of artificial intelligence, because of the virtual or augmented reality, because of the bioengineering, right? When we are starting to grow our own bones, right? And to your point, there's a lot of sort of the futuristic fantasy over the next 10 years will start becoming a reality because we will become more of cyborgs than we were before. Where it leads us, what makes human versus robot, what it means for somebody to live 160 years, probably more of a philosophical versus the technological conversation.
Good morning, good evening, hello, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kevin Garber. I am the CEO of Manage Flitter. I'm also the co-host of the It's a Monkey podcast. We are episode number 86 of the It's a Monkey podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. It is Wednesday, the 22nd of March, if you are watching us live on Periscope, and a special hello to everyone who's watching us live on Periscope. And it is Friday, the 24th of March for anyone that is listening on the podcast or watching us on YouTube. We are now on YouTube as well, so you can subscribe on YouTube. Just search for It's a Monkey podcast, and you'll head over to the right part of the YouTube channel where you can subscribe. Today we have a great show coming up. I will be interviewing Maciek Krantz, who is the best-selling author of Building the Internet of Things, a great book about the Internet of Things, IoT. It's a word you might be stumbling across every now and then. We'll find out what does that actually mean and what that is all about. That's coming up later on in the show. But as usual, we kick off with some tech news. And today I've got my co-host with me as usual, Kate Frappel, and we've also got another guest in the studio, Jo Pinto, who's the business operations manager at Manage Flitter, and she's going to be giving us some insight into one of the news stories. But let's kick it off first with Kate. Kate, what's happening in the news this week in the tech industry?
So a autonomous delivery robot by Spaceship Technologies is going to be launching in Virginia.
So this is in the US.
Yes.
And this isn't a drone. This is a little robot that wanders around on wheels, right?
Yes, 6 wheels, resembles a cooler, so like something that you put your drinks in.
We call those eskies in Australia,
yes,
but Americans call them coolers.
Coolers, yeah. So they resemble a cooler. They can go within 3 kilometers in 15 to 30 minutes. So they can take your groceries, parcels, and even food as well.
Right. And so they've made these legal, or they've mandated that it's okay for these to be used. I saw that part of the requirement was that they had to follow all the street signs, and so it stops at traffic lights and doesn't. So it's not going to cause havoc.
No. They're quite light as well, and they have to abide by the law, and they have sensors that can go around obstacles, and they also need to have like a license plate or an ID similar to a car. Yeah.
So slowly these robots are taking shape, and soon they'll be wandering around amongst us.
And it's not the first one. So Yelp and a food delivery service in the States called Eat24. I've also tried one, but it's nowhere near as stylish. And Domino's as well tried one in New Zealand. So it could take 10 pizzas, and it also has like a cooling section so you can put your drinks in there.
And these were robots, not drones?
Robots.
Okay, interesting. So, it's one thing that I think cities could really play their part in accelerating innovation would actually be to push forward with things like that. I mean, imagine if Sydney in the CBD, it's a relatively small area, and they should be trialing these things and experimenting and encouraging some innovation and companies. There's, always a lot of spin-off technologies from innovative activities. Who knows what it would land up doing? It's always disappointing that politicians at all levels of the game are a little bit half asleep. You know, we've got a city here, lots of people, there's technologies and technologists everywhere. Why aren't we doing this tech's available? Why aren't we trialing these things in even certain precincts in certain areas? Let's keep things moving forward.
Well, there's a lot of associated dangers with them as well. Some people are concerned with terrorist activities, the security, surveillance, and even just like government monitoring, like what can you attach to these robots?
You suddenly have someone following you at night on your way.
I'd love to know how you can, for example, you see one of these Domino's ones going around, somebody wants a pizza, they're just going to hijack it. Because you can know that there's a pizza.
Maybe it can have little water pistols, and if like the wrong person comes too close with facial ID, it can actually just shoot the water pistols and defend the pizzas.
Maybe. I mean, apparently you have like an order code that you put in order to open it when it gets to your house.
Right.
But what's to stop someone just picking it up and taking it home?
But you see, that's why we've got to trial these things, because all these issues surface themselves only after you working with them, right?
Yeah, but it's costly as well.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, in things like nursing and things like that, could have huge applications. In Japan, I believe they've already got robots that comfort elderly people. Japan's got a massive problem with the aging population, and it's a big issue that they got, there's a disparity in demographic sizes, and they've got robots that comfort older people, and hopefully soon we'll be able to deliver medicines to them. So the future is here. Interesting. Thanks for that, Kate. Josephine Pinto, thank you for joining us on the podcast. You featured in one of the previous podcasts talking about the Google Pixel. How's your Google Pixel going?
My Google Pixel is still going very well. Can't complain. I'm still waiting for the Note 8, but, Google Pixel will do for now.
Tell us what's happening in the news this week.
Yeah, so Google Maps have released a new version of and added features to Google Maps.
We haven't spoken much about Google Apps on the show, and it's actually interesting you brought that up, because it's probably one of the apps that people use the most, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's Google Maps. So I think we should actually talk more about some of these little features. So tell us about this new feature that Google Apps has released.
So the new feature that they have is it can detect that you've parked your car, and then it'll ask you if you want to save that parking spot. So you can add a picture, take some notes of where you've parked your car, and then you can also even put a time limit on it. So if you're in a spot that has a time limit on it, it will do a countdown for you and send you notifications.
Now, here's an idea. What about having one of these little robots, right, escort you to your car? Wouldn't that be like one of the big Westfields, right? Wouldn't it be fantastic that that it works out who you are and you get an escort back to your car? In the big Westfield, they have security there that half of their day are escorting people back. People get lost. It's a very confusing car park here in one of the big Westfield shopping centres in Sydney.
Yeah, it's true. And I've even gotten lost as well. And you have to go up and down the different levels and half levels, and yeah, it can be very confusing. So the robot idea is actually a really good idea.
It's a good idea,
yeah.
Right? Escort, and you could even have it sponsored by a company. So and you can even have Domino's Pizza, and they throw in a slice of pizza while they're walking you. So Google Maps, that's a great idea. You can it tags it on your map. You can put in a photo. You can put in some other notes. How does it work with anything that it offers special for multi-story car parks?
No, there's nothing for that at the moment. It's literally just a marker on your map.
Right.
So,
does it disappear automatically after time? Or
it does. So one of the complaints is that if you're going on a business trip and you're leaving your car somewhere in a long-term parking spot, if you go overseas and you've got your location on, it will actually just override that. So you can lose that information.
Right. So they should probably put some option if you want to save it, because you don't want to clutter it up with. You probably want to keep it for a day unless it's a long-term thing. Any other? You're an organizer. You're a great person. Optimizing efficiency. Any other tips for Google Maps that you think would be useful to someone listening to this that might not be well known?
Yeah, definitely. So I actually just discovered this very recently. I can't believe that I hadn't discovered it earlier, but you can actually now save, your favorite places and places you want to go in the future. You used to only be able to save your home and your work place, and that was it. And you can also star places as well. So I guess that's favorites.
And some people don't know about the feature called, I think it's called pinning, where you can share a pin. Or you can share a location with someone, right?
Yeah, that's right. You can even pinpoint a whole bunch of different places on a map and send that particular map to a person.
So a lot of people don't actually realize this. I mean, I sent it to a friend the other day, and they said, "Look, wow, it's amazing." He just clicked on it, took him to the Google Maps, and and I have never really received that. I think from James, probably at your wedding, funnily enough, where it was a tricky location, and he sent me a Google Maps pin. So, but besides that, I've never actually received something. So it's a very easy way to share a location.
Yeah, and they are working on all that sharing functionality at the moment. So, once you've got your car spot marked, you can share that now. They're really making it easy to share that information around.
There used to be an app called Google Latitude. I think it was called Latitude. Do you ever remember where you could switch it on and people could follow where you are?
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
And it had a little bit of traction. I know, especially married couples, or they would like to for almost half novelty effect, sort of see where their partners were during the day. And but it never really took off. I wonder if it still exists.
Oh, it would be interesting if it does. But yeah, while you're looking for that, I also discovered that with Google Maps, they're doing some funky stuff. You know the movie Kong, Skull Island, which recently came out?
No.
Okay, so Kong, Skull Island, they actually created a place on the map of an island that obviously does not exist, a fake island, and they invited people to write reviews about this island, and it was sort of like an advertisement for that movie, which is really different. Yeah.
I'm just reading now about Google Latitude. So Google shut down Google Latitude in 2013, so it actually hasn't been around for a while. So, and it's actually interesting that an equivalent app has. I know there's all the privacy concerns, but there is a use case where when people, I mean, families have these WhatsApp groups. You can almost picture these people wanting to, especially people go on holiday to Japan together. There's 10 on them, to be able to look at a map and just see where everyone is the whole time. And it's interesting that an app hasn't sort of emerged for these use cases.
No, that would be very useful though. Very, very useful.
Okay, Josephine Pinto, Business Operations Manager at Manage Flitter. Nice to have you on the show. Maybe we'll drag you in a little bit more to help us out with the podcast. We're going to take a short break, and after that, we're going to be chatting to Maciej Krantz, who's the author of a book on Internet of Things, and we'll be talking about IoT, Internet of Things. So stick with us, and we'll be back after the short break.
Hi, this is Dave with Manage Flitter. Manage Flitter is a tool that helps you work smarter and faster on Twitter. With Manage Flitter, you can clean up and grow your Twitter account. You'll also get useful Twitter analytics, social content scheduling, and much more. Go to manageflitter.com and start your free trial today.
You're back with It's a Monkey podcast. We talk about everything relating to technology, entrepreneurship, startups, and every now and then we like to zoom out onto bigger picture industry trends and issues. And one aspect we haven't actually chatted about is the Internet of Things, also known as IoT. And I'm happy to say I found an expert on the topic in Silicon Valley, Maciej Krantz, who's the author of the book Building the Internet of Things. And he's also the Vice President, Corporate Strategic Innovation Group at Cisco Systems. Maciej, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Great to be here.
Let's just take one step back. I think it's one of these buzzwords that a lot of people hear about, Internet of Things, IoT. It's a word that I believe that's actually been thrown around for quite a long time, I believe since the mid-90s or mid-80s. Is that right?
That's correct. So, yeah, I think the term was originally coined in the 90s to talk about the RFID networks. But
right.
to be honest, I think 6 or 7 years ago when we were deciding on how to call this phenomenon of everything being connected to everything. We just decided to adopt this term and expand its scope instead of inventing the new term.
Now, RFID, of course, are those radio chip tags that have had a lot of promise that they'll revolutionize retailing and things like that, which hasn't quite sort of executed yet, has it?
Correct, but at the same time, when you look at Internet of Things, it actually is real, and that's probably one of the differences here. RFID was sort of ahead of its time. We're starting to see some great adoptions now of sort of a third and fourth generation of RFID tags and technologies. But unlike RFID, I think with IoT, it's been a great journey because we've seen early successes, and we're just building on top of those.
So let's take a step back. Just paint a picture of a definition, so to speak, a working definition of what IoT is.
Yes, and it's actually a great way to start because there's a lot of different misconceptions about IoT. Effectively, in a nutshell, IoT is about every device, everything getting connected to everything, to each other, to the networks, to the internet sometimes. But so the devices like cars and robots and vending machines and buildings, even trash cans are getting connected. But unlike the first wave of internet, sort of the first 30 years of commercial internet, where the main role of the connected devices was to give you and I the ability to communicate like we're doing now, communicating with each other, getting access to the data, getting access to online processes. The main role of the Internet of Things devices is to generate the data. And then we take this data to create the business outcomes.
Interesting. So give us an example, perhaps even a consumer type example where this is in play. Perhaps motor cars, the new motor cars that they connected and probably generating a massive amount of data as you're driving, and most of it's probably not that useful, but every now and then an actionable piece of data surfaces, right?
You're absolutely right. And so before I dive into the connected vehicle example, one of the misconceptions about Internet of Things is that it is primarily happening in a consumer space, in connected home and so forth. I was at the Consumer Electronics Show a couple of weeks ago, and we saw these connected fridges and connected toasters and so forth. And while I think this feature is useful for these home appliances, the reality is that sort of the business use cases for why we should be interconnecting classes of devices in the home are just starting to emerge, like connected, let's say elderly care or home security. So most of the applications that we see in Internet of Things today are actually happening on the business side. And connected vehicle is one example that maybe is straddling sort of both worlds. But when you think about over the next 2 years, pretty much every new car will be connected. And on average, a single connected car generates 2 petabytes of data every year. So it's huge, right? And from that perspective, because all the sensors, all the subsystems that are all generating data. So when you think about the application like preventive maintenance, which is quite popular for in transportation, logistics, in mining, like in Australia, for example, in open pit mines, when you would anticipate potential failures of components in the vehicle, let's say 3 months in advance, so you have time to fix it before it breaks down. In this scenario, the benefit is tremendous, right? Especially like in the open pit mine, when every day the hauling truck is out of commission, it costs the company up to $2 million. But the interesting part here is that it actually, in order to implement such a system, we had to develop a new architecture. So traditionally, when you think about, let's say, cloud computing, the first generation of cloud computing architectures were focused on batch processing. So let's say you have 30 years of seismic data and you process that information. Mm-hmm. Or you connect a bunch of vending machines to the cloud directly because you send only a few packets every couple of days saying, hey, please come over because I'm running out of cans, right? In this kind of scenario, data-intensive scenarios like connected vehicle, we actually talk about what we call a fog computing or distributed cloud architecture, where you process a lot of data in the vehicle itself and only send exceptions. Like, for example, hey, an element in the engine is breaking, please fix it. Here is the latest insurance data, or here is the software update is required. So you basically get only the essential alerts back to the cloud through the, let's say, a wireless network, and process the majority of data coming out of the sensors locally in the vehicle itself.
Now, where I see this being hugely useful in quote unquote preventative maintenance is the human body, right? It would be revolutionary if we could sensor up on the inside and we get these exceptions and say, hey, if you carry on this way, you are going to have, there is no issue now, but according to all the models, you are going to have an issue if you don't start sleeping more or don't start eating more greens. Or that would be absolutely revolutionary.
And I think that so now we're moving from what's happening now into the future, but it's an interesting concept, right? Where you think about Internet of Things, all of the elements connecting and becoming a foundation of a true evolution, right? So because of artificial intelligence, because of the virtual or augmented reality, because of the bioengineering, right? When we are starting to grow our own bones, right? And to your point, there's a lot of sort of the futuristic fantasy over the next 10 years will start becoming a reality, because we will become more of cyborgs than we were before. Where it leads us, what makes human versus robot, what it means for somebody to live 160 years, probably more of a philosophical versus the technological conversation.
That's going to be the hard aspect in a way, but it's already halfway there. I mean, a couple of years ago, I bumped into a chap that was relatively young. He was in his 40s, and he had a congenital heart condition, and he had a pacemaker of sorts. And he said to me that his cardiologist can track exactly what's happening in his office. So I'm not quite sure what. I think it connected somehow to his phone or the mobile network, or it had a SIM card. I can't remember exactly, but it was. I mean, that's an example, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, if you look at the applications, you mentioned monitoring of pacemakers of devices. There's increasing use of applications, for example, for, again, elderly care, when you would monitor the vital signs and conditions in sort of elderly homes, but also in people's homes, right? If, for example, somebody suddenly falls down, or if their heart rate drops, immediately this information gets sent to the appropriate folks. But this is just a starting point. The beauty of IoT is that we're seeing a fairly broad sort of adoption across multiple industries. So we've talked about healthcare. You see adoption in agriculture, precision farming with irrigations, and even managing a complete tomato farm or winery, to manufacturing applications with connecting processes across manufacturing floor. Like, for example, Harley Davidson implemented this kind of a system, and as a result, they were able to reduce the time it takes you and I to order a custom bike to the time we actually get the bike, from 18 months to 2 weeks, right? You see the adoption of IoT in mining, as I mentioned, in transportation, as we discussed, smart cities. I mentioned, garbage collection, right? It's becoming a big use case in addition of parking and outdoor lighting. Retail as well. So I think that's the beauty of it. Is IoT is multiple markets, and there's actually complex markets. But IoT adoption, what we've been seeing over the last couple of years, have been fairly broad.
I love the concept of the connected city. Makes so much sense, even from a transportation point of view. If you just take smart cars, the difficulty of humans, they're very good with maybe gray areas and judgments, but they're very bad at large amounts of data. But whereas computers are very good at it. So, every single car in a city can know exactly where every other car is in the city and optimize for it. And that can, again, revolutionize transport, not only from a congestion point of view, but from a safety point of view as well, right?
You're absolutely right. And I think what the challenge with connected, with smart city has been not lack of ideas like what you mentioned and the clear benefits that you mentioned, but how do we actually make it work from the business perspective, right? So, smart city has been, we've sort of went through the 10-year of a sort of a crossing the desert period from vision and beautiful slides to how do we actually make it work and who pays for this? And I'm happy to say that, and I believe there are some great examples in Australia as well. Like at Cisco, for example, we work with over 100 different cities. But the key to the success was identifying the initial applications that would drive the deployment of the citywide infrastructure.
So give us an example of one city that's doing something interesting in this area.
So Barcelona has been probably the longest standing sort of a lab for us. And in their case, yes, they've had a broad vision, which was let's make our city smart city to make it more useful for people in terms of transportation, in terms of services, but also make it more friendly for businesses. But they started with smart parking, right? And the benefit is obvious for us, to the consumer, but it worked for them from the business perspective also, because by installing this smart parking infrastructure, they were able to increase the utilization of the parking spots. They were able to vary pricing and thus make more money, and also reduce the cost of managing the parking infrastructure. So as a result, they sought, by implementing the system, which obviously is very beneficial for us consumers, but they saw 20% decrease in the cost of operating the parking infrastructure in the city, and 30% increase in revenues. So we've been looking for these types of use cases and applications where it makes financial sense for the city or for the private-public partnership that will allow us to start the city on the journey. And once you've done it, you can add lighting, you can add physical security, you can get smart transportation systems, you can get into sporting events and so forth. So sky is the limit. But it's been the tough thing to start with the first step.
And parking is just such an obvious first step because it's actually a static resource, right? It's not actually moving. There's a lot of predictability around it. I mean, if we've got apps for cars and like Uber, and it makes total sense that with a bit of thought, you could have an app when you're looking for a parking space in a certain area. Yep. It allocates you one, it takes it off the market, and anyone else looking for the next 10 minutes until it's filled. I mean, it's in the scheme of things, it's relatively simple. I mean, it's crazy that in some cities in Australia, I think I stand to be corrected, but I think in Melbourne or maybe even in parts of Sydney or, you've got to drive around and hunt for a parking space. B, you have to put in coins into a meter. And then you have to, when the meter runs out, you got to run down and put more coins in. I mean, the cities, one of the purposes I believe of, political leadership is to lubricate the wheels of technology and bring it down into cities and states and the countries. And they should really be doing the value. It's not just a convenience thing, as you mentioned. It's less pollution because cars are driving around less. It's less accidents because there's less cars on the road and congestion, etc. So the flow and effects are actually very tangible and important.
You're absolutely right. And if you think about the whole concept of connected vehicle, right? When you think about, I don't know if you drive to work, but I do, right? And so my day usually starts with, I get up, I jump in a car, I get stuck in a traffic jam. The most frustrating piece is getting stuck on the red light when there's no cross traffic going through. Hopefully you don't get into accident and then you spend time, looking for parking, right? So that's sort of our daily routine. It's fascinating. We actually calculated on the global basis that we actually, if I remember correctly, as a society, we waste around 5 billion hours, or equivalent of 2% of global GDP, we waste getting stuck in traffic jams, looking for parking and so forth. And when you think about a connected vehicle, actually solves a lot of these things, right? We mentioned parking, but it's also, we've been working on the systems for vehicles to connect to vehicles, but also vehicles connecting to the infrastructure. So now the intelligent intersection can sense, okay, there is 20 cars coming in one direction, 2 cars coming in the opposite direction. Maybe I will let these 20 cars go through. I will pass this information to the next intersection. You can start creating a green wave. So you can start dynamically managing the infrastructure.
And for computers, this is almost trivial tasks.
Exactly. But it's also interesting because when we get into this conversation further, you would start looking more and more into autonomous vehicles, and where you could argue the opposite will be happening, which is we will not need a lot of parking spots anymore because we will have a fleet of autonomous vehicles that will just driving us around, right?
And we can turn them all into bike lanes, right?
Hopefully, exactly, or walking places, or flying drones, or whatever we want to do.
Maciek, a couple of other questions. The one thing that I'm sure a lot of people listening to the show would be very interested in, security, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot. Everything's connected to everything, which means that if someone gets in, they can do all sorts of damage, and in case of cars and even agriculture, serious damage. If they up the fertilizer, that's potentially toxic, and they can impact the food, etc. How do we, is this baked into some of the protocols and these platforms? What's the industry's take on the security side of things?
It's probably the number one question I get, not only from the consumers but also from the businesses. Right? It's a big concern, and if I look at the recent denial of service attacks, for example, they actually served as a good wake-up call for the industry. So I sort of compare it to, I don't know if you remember 15 years ago or so when we introduced Wi-Fi systems, and we had similar problems, right?
Sure.
Non-enterprise grade clients, Wi-Fi clients being attached to MRI machines and people hacking into them. It's the same thing that we're seeing now. If you think about the denial of service attacks, so basically the hackers were taking advantage of default names and passwords on some consumer cameras in Vietnam, right? We as an industry have solved this problem a long time ago. So a lot of this is about the industry, the vendors working together on interoperability, best practices. When you think about, there's a Verizon study that says 70% of security incidents come from kind of exploiting known vulnerabilities, meaning things that we know are potentially broken and we know how to fix them.
It's the equivalent of if you leave your car door unlocked the whole time, you're going to get broken into because it's open. But if you lock it,
trouble.
Exactly, it's hardly going to happen.
So I've seen vendors really starting to work together much more. I am starting to see vendors both on the consumer side and on the enterprise side investing more in IoT security. But I think it's fair to say that my sense is IoT security is everybody's job. Yes, it's vendors, and they're getting their act together and doing more than they used to. But it's also businesses. Like for example. Even 5 or 6 years ago, when I talked to car manufacturers, many of them would say, the way we secure our plants is basically security by obscurity. I'm not connecting my plant to the outside world, which was very naive because then we had a Stuxnet malware actually happening on these networks. I think 5 years ago, they've discovered virtual private networks connecting their contractors and their suppliers on the manufacturing floors. So now the businesses are moving to a much more comprehensive security architectures. Are looking at before, how do I prevent people from hacking into my system? During, how quickly I discovered I got hacked and what data was hacked? And after, how do I deal with this problem, right? But it's also us as consumers, right? If we connect the camera, let's check for obvious things like, is there a default name and password? Hopefully in a year or two, there will not be that problem anymore. But for now, we do have it. So let's check on these things. It's also us as employees, integrating sort of a common security approaches into everything that we do. Like, for example, somebody is tailgating you as trying to enter your data center. Okay, let's not do that. Let's remember, half of the cyber attacks actually are initiated within the enterprises. So that's why I believe it's everybody's responsibility. Yes, we're making progress, but everybody, whether I'm wearing a consumer hat, employee hat, or a business hat, or a vendor hat, we have a role to play.
There's a saying in business that most bullets are self-inflicted. And I think in the tech industry, that's very much an issue. Maciek, blockchain. Now, blockchain is a very interesting technology. It's a distributed system of trust that a lot of people say is going to revolutionize a lot of aspects of our world, including banking and smart contracts and things like that. How did blockchain technologies dovetail with IoT, and any real world examples that you can share with us?
Yeah, I'm actually a big believer in blockchain, but probably more of private blockchains than public blockchains. But I think we are, like with IoT, probably 2 or 3 years ago, when it was on top of the hype curve, we are sort of at the same stage with blockchain, when I often, in conversations, whatever question is asked, blockchain is the answer. And but the reality is that there are lots of applications in the IoT space, from supply chain. How do we trace the components? For example, a couple of years ago, we had floods in Malaysia, and then it triggered a shortage of supply of hard drives, right? Because some components in Malaysia, so five layers into the supply chain, were impacted. So we can now look at the whole supply chain holistically. We can trace. I'm sure you've heard the examples of blood diamonds, how we can now trace the source of diamonds, but we can also trace the source of food, right? So if there is a salmonella outbreak, we can know exactly where it came from. We can trace, let's say, pharmaceuticals, right? And making sure that we're getting the right pharmaceuticals and from the right sources. So
you're saying with the blockchain, you can track details of the value chain a lot more accurately?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, in general, I believe blockchain is one of these transformational technologies like IoT, and it's converting from a sort of internet into the ability of actually transact value, as you mentioned. And the combination of IoT and blockchain gives us the ability to have complete visibility and trust into where our food, our medications, our products are coming from. And managing all of this experiences, from recalls to a source of identifying the right sources of where the goods are coming from, and so forth. So I think the combination will be very powerful, but it's fairly early. If I look at blockchain overall, of course, most of the focus has been on financial services, and that's probably another conversation of what's real, what's not there. But I would say this year we will see some of the production implementations of blockchain, but we will, for majority of use cases, will still be at the proof of concept level.
I mean, I'm very into nutrition and food and the impact on health. And one of the issues is certification of organic food and biodynamic food. The industry obviously has a certification program, but you're never quite sure. The temptation, I would imagine, for unscrupulous suppliers to just claim certification is the upside's very big, and the downside of getting caught, I mean, it's very difficult for them to get caught. And that's a real world example how the people that would like genuine certification, you really do, and you are happy to pay a little bit more for a high quality organically grown product. And that would be a terrific problem to solve if that can be, guaranteed that trust is there.
And this is a great example. I'm sure in Australia you have the same movement of sort of buying local, right? And that making sure that this lettuce that you're buying actually is local, right? And so there are lots and lots of examples where, again, a combination of every device being connected, everything being connected, with power of blockchain, when you have immutability and the traceability of goods as well as transactions, actually will create some probably a lot of examples that you and I can't think of right now.
And that's the exciting part. And interesting, I know Cisco have some labs in Everleigh Carriage Works in Sydney, and there's actually a local farmers market in that exact space on every Saturday morning in Sydney. So that's an interesting connection. Maciek, you are Vice President of the Corporate Strategic Innovation Group at Cisco. What does that actually mean? What does your day-to-day actually entail?
Sure. So I probably have one of the coolest jobs at Cisco. So I basically my team does three things. One is we incubate new businesses, and we look at lots of things. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was running the IoT business unit, right, which is why I wrote the book and continues to be my passion. But we look at things like drones, blockchains, artificial intelligence, and other things. Second one is we focus on co-innovating with our customers and partners, which is why we actually have an innovation center in Sydney. We have one also in Perth, where we work with our customers and partners. Like in Sydney, for example, the main focus is on agriculture. In Perth, obviously, is on transportation and resources. And we work with research institutions. We work with farmers, for example. We work with lots of our partners, in this case in Australia, but also around the globe, to develop these solutions that take advantage of IoT, of blockchain, of real-time analytics to improve the business. And the last part of the job is internal innovation, making sure that if there's a great idea coming from, let's say, a salesperson in Sydney, that we can actually help him or her make it happen.
It's a fantastic job, really. Very, I'm sure you're the envy of many people. Maciej Krantz is the author of Building the Internet of Things, a fantastic book if you're interested in the today and the tomorrow of the Internet of Things. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's published by Wiley. I got the Amazon Kindle version, which I like reading especially my business books for some reason on Kindle. It's weird. They separated books I read for pleasure. I tend to enjoy the hard copy, but the business ones I tend to enjoy on Kindle. So it's available on Kindle. Maciej's also the vice president of corporate strategic. He's the vice president of corporate strategic, the innovation group at Cisco Systems. And we'll put all the links up on the show notes. Maciej, I really appreciate your time. Very interesting. No doubt it's an exciting future ahead for us in the industry.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really appreciate it. That was great chat, and look forward to charting the future together.
Absolutely.
The It's a Monkey podcast is brought to you by CheckDog. Use CheckDog to easily review and monitor your website for spelling errors, broken links, and broken images, all with the push of one button. CheckDog can also automatically monitor your website and notify you of newly introduced spelling errors. Go to checkdog.com/podcast to receive 50% off your first month subscription. Checkdog.com, helping the world's leading websites keep their content error-free.
Okay, what's so amazing about the Internet of Things, the volume of data that Maciej spoke about. I mean, the amount of data that your car is going to generate is really quite remarkable. And I guess, as he mentioned, the real challenge of this industry is actually wrangling this data and getting interesting bits and pieces out of it. And, we'll probably be able to surface all sorts of things. I remember when Jawbone, you remember Jawbone, the fitness tracker?
Yeah.
And came out, and they obviously had Jawbone. People used to sleep with the Jawbone as well because it could track your sleep patterns, and Jawbone had access to everyone's sleep patterns. And I remember they published some research around people's sleep patterns, and I think there was an earthquake in San Francisco, and they published the sleep patterns around that. I think it was about 2-3 in the morning, and they published the sleep patterns of how people woke up and then how they went back to sleep. And it was really, and obviously they didn't surface individuals' information. It was all on aggregates. So the privacy was all okay. But it was really fascinating to see how you can observe a population in that way. And the Internet of Things is really, that's going to be one of the flow-on effects, just to see this population of data being able to be analyzed and what it will surface out of that data.
Well, I always found the sleep tracking a little bit creepy. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, the sort of information that comes out of this data is invaluable. I guess the most interesting part for me, especially from this interview, was autonomous driving. There's a famous sort of theory, I guess, called the trolley problem, And it basically says, if you had to choose between a group of 5 adults and 1 3-year-old, who do you choose?
And I think with humans, when they're faced with that in a split second, they don't have time to think about that. But if you're sitting around a table and designing an algorithm,
you're responsible.
Yeah, very, very tricky. And again, our industry is saying we are not talking about these issues enough. We are not talking about the ethical, moral, legal implications of AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. We need to start talking about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, do you give it the power to the individual driver to make that a setting when they buy their car? Or do you give that to the manufacturer? Or is it a government thing?
Yeah, I personally think it should be a government mandated, based with consultation with the industry, that there's an approach to it. There's an approach that levels the playing field. If you leave it up to the manufacturer, word will get out that manufacturer X prioritizes you, and it could get messy. I think one of the government's role, and I'm a believer in a relative size of government. There's all these debates between small government, big government, but one of the roles of government is to level the playing field, and it should level the playing field around all of this, and that's why we should debate and chat about these issues. A couple of podcasts ago, we chatted with Anil Dash. It was a fantastic episode. You go back and listen if you haven't listened to it. But one of the things he mentioned is that most of the elected officials in Washington are very technologically illiterate, not even sophisticated. They're illiterate. Very concerning when this wave is about to start and going to have all sorts of disruptive effects. Anyway, that's episode 86 of the It's a Monkey podcast. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Facebook. You can email us, podcast@itsamonkey.com, if you'd like to be interviewed. We're always looking for interesting people to interview. If you just want to say hi, and keep an eye out on Periscope. We do try to keep the times approximate on Wednesday evening American time, so we will try to keep on periscoping. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you later.